Welcome to the session. I probably have the first announcement I want to make is, even though the title of this session is how to build a new housing development, what we're really going to focus on in this session is the low-income housing tax credit program. My name is Bill Mulrichter. I'm with Baker Tilly. I'm moderating this session. Very happy to be here. Glad you're all here. I guess the first thing, before we introduce the panel, I want to maybe just recommend that folks turn off their cell phones, and we'll have questions at the end. And it's going to be like rapid fire. A lot of slides, a ton of information. You can talk about the low-income housing tax credit program for like an entire day. They're going to give you maybe three components from three different perspectives. The developer, WEDA, which is the Wisconsin Housing and Economic Development Authority, and then really from the investor side, because someone's got to buy the credit, essentially, and infuse the project with equity. So why are we talking about the low-income housing tax credit? I guess what I'll say is first is that capitalism sucks. Actually doesn't suck. But it's inadequate for the problem. As we've been hearing in the other sessions, the market is not really addressing affordable or moderate income product. They're not producing enough of it. Whatever they're producing is usually for the high end of the market. So, and why are we talking about tax credits is when you reach in the toolbox for some tool to address this, that's the biggest tool. That's the tool you grab first. It's the most powerful product that the United States really has to produce an affordable housing product. So that's why we're talking about it. That's the focus for today. Can you advance the slide just real quick? I'll just introduce everyone. We're going to go in order. Nicole Solheim is Director of Development with Gorman & Company. She's going to be speaking from the developer's point of view. Sridhar Ranabat is Commercial Lending Officer for WEDA, Wisconsin Housing and Economic Development Authority. They are the state entity that allocates the credits. They're responsible for the credit. The credit comes from the U.S. Treasury. Marge Novak is the Executive Vice President with Scenair, and she's going to talk about the investors who invest in the credit and their motivations. So without further ado, again, questions at the end. Nicole.
Here we go. Okay. Hi everyone, Nicole from Gorman & Company. So from a developer standpoint, I'm going to use a project that we have that's under construction in the city of Sun Prairie, which I see Scott, he's very familiar with this one. As an example from how you go, in this case, from a kind of industrial site on their main street that was primarily vacant, an old trucking company was there, into a new affordable housing development. All in 5 easy steps. No, I'm kidding. There's actually a lot more steps than that. But although every project is different, every community is a little different, there's kind of a basic process that we run through as a developer, which I'm going to try to give you an idea of. So it all starts out with what I call the developer roadshow. Usually it is me and someone else on my team getting in the car, driving around the state of Wisconsin, meeting with communities, meeting with staff in municipalities and saying, hey, what's going on in your community? Are there areas that you're looking to redevelop? What are your priorities? What can we do to help? That's really important because as a developer, I don't want to go into a community and say, this is what I think you should do, or this is what I want to do for you. It's a lot easier if there's a plan I can look at, or a priority that the community has identified that I am going to then try to meet. So that's really what we try to do at Gorman & Company. Then you have to tune into the local politics, of course, meet with city officials, elected officials, Chamber of Commerce. If there's been a housing study done recently, that's really helpful. And just kind of get into what the community is working on. In this case, the city of Sun Prairie had recently started a Main Street redevelopment plan, which was actually, I think, funded in part by Dane County, which included this site. Thank you. Such service. And this site was actually identified as a priority redevelopment site in that plan, which was very helpful in terms of getting it approved, but also applying for funding sources, because you can talk about how our project is really meeting a community need in terms of redevelopment and also affordable housing. I'm going to leave most of this to Sridhar to talk about the WIDA process, but of course we want the site and the development to meet a community need, but at the same time it has to be competitive and be able to get funding. So we have to look at it from one standpoint of the community, and then look at how does it fit within WIDA's QAP, which Sridhar will talk about. Is it eligible for funding? Are we going to be able to get all of the gap financing that we need? Because without that, it can't move forward. So this site, again, was on Main Street in Sun Prairie. It had a great walk score. It was close to a lot of amenities, schools. There was not a bus route at the time, although it's not far from the new bus service in Sun Prairie. And it was in several zones, which get you points for WIDA, which Sridhar, again, will talk about. It was in a TIF district, which was very important, both obviously from a financial standpoint. We did apply to the city and receive TIF financing for this project. But it was also helpful from another one of our financing sources. This, again, was a site that was identified as blighted in that TIF district, and that was needed for another financing source that we got from the county. The next steps, once we've kind of have a site or an area in mind, is figuring out, okay, what can we put on here? Gorman and Company has in-house architecture, general contractor, property management, so we work on the project from inception to the end to operations. That does make it pretty easy for me to just kind of walk up to my architect's office and say, what can we fit on here? How many units that fit within the city's ordinances for parking and all of that? Then I work with my construction guys to get an idea of the general price and run the numbers with a financial analyst. And if it looks like it's penciling out or it's pretty close, we try to get it under site control, which sounds like a simple thing, but is not easy in this world, especially in this market. It's pretty hot. It's hard to get stuff under site control. And as you will see by the end of this whole panel, this is a very long process. And when you're working with a private seller, you need to say, hey, we'd like to buy your land, but can we have it under contract for like 2 years and have a bunch of contingencies so we can get out of it at any time if our financing doesn't come through? It's not really an easy conversation to have with the seller. Sometimes you end up paying a little bit more, so you get that extra time so they don't sell it to someone else that can close in 2 months. So once you have it under site control, you can say, okay, let's meet with the city again and talk about our ideas for this now that we have control of the property. Talk about next steps, zoning, TIF, financing, all of that fun stuff. Talk to the local alder, make sure that you can get them on board or get initial feedback that you can hopefully incorporate into your plan. And then start doing some of that, what we call due diligence, title work, looking up environmental. This did require some environmental remediation. Look at a market study to confirm our rents. In Dane County, affordable housing is in high demand, so we don't usually run into problems with our market study these days. Identify partners. We did partner with the Dane County Housing Authority on this project because they had a presence in Sun Prairie as well. So we started that partnership, and then you'll need to engage your other consultants. Engineers are required for the zoning process, for example. Any other third-party consultants, you'll start engaging them here and then throughout the whole process. Then we start the fun process of applying for all of our funding sources, which we'll talk about later. Public meetings. The number of public meetings definitely varies depending on the community. Zoning approval will always have public hearings and public meetings. The time frame for that can vary wildly. It can be a couple weeks. City of Madison could be like 9 months. So you have to take that into account when you're planning out your timeline. In this case, we had Plan Commission and Council meetings to approve the rezoning. We had a couple iterations and made adjustments along the way to our plan. We also had CDA and Council approvals for that TIF financing that I mentioned. The strategy for those public meetings, as everyone knows, a lot of times at public meetings, you get primarily people that may show up that oppose it. That's not new news to anyone here, I'm sure. But it is a really important strategy, especially for a high-profile project, to identify partners that support your project, that support your mission. In this case, the Chamber of Commerce plays a really big role in the city of Sun Prairie. Identify local employers or anyone that is in the community that can even just, email an alder or show up at a meeting and just register and support. Just having some people in support makes a huge difference when you're at a public meeting. You don't feel so alone as a developer when you're there. And the timing of this is all of these approvals, again, talking about why we need to have a site under control for so long, is that we need to have all of that zoning done and our TIF approval all done before we even apply to Sridhar for tax credits, because he requires that. So speaking of that, I'm going to turn it over to Sridhar.
Okay. Do I need microphone or we're good? Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Great, thank you. So happy to be here as well, talking on behalf of WIDA and talking about the low-income housing tax credits from WIDA perspective. But before I start going on to WIDA, let me just reflect back. And I looked at, all the projects that we did in Dane County, going back to actually 2003, which is where we had in our warehouse data-wise, and looked at all the projects, what we funded. And I want to kind of connect the dots between the Dane County Housing Fund, that started 5 years ago with $2 million rolling annually. It's increased significantly, as Joe Parisi said this morning, and what's happened at WIDA as well. So before, if I look at the data, 2015 to 2019, we received 29 projects. We received more than that, but we funded 29 projects, 2,400 units. 2,000 of them were affordable. So if I go back, 10 years prior to that, and even go back all the way to 2003 to 2014, can anybody guess what was the production at that time? It's kind of interesting in that it was about the same. We had 29 applications as well from 2003 to 2014, producing 2,100 units, and 1,900 of those were affordable units. So clearly you can kind of connect, the dots of ramping up of the projects and the units in the last 5 years, and that's no accident because the city and the county has really taken the leadership in creating these affordable housing funds, and in our mind, that's really increased the activity in Dane County, and that's really terrific, and we want to really, this is clearly an example that I want to kind of show. So with that said, let's go on to WIDA and just talk a little bit about what we do, and what we have to offer to produce low-income housing units. So we are one of the entities, and it's perfect that we're kind of sitting together here. I call it three-legged stool as well. So developer here, an investor, and myself, we're just the connecting dot that has the federal credit that comes to the state, and that gets monetized with the connection between developer and investor. And, Marge is going to talk more about that later, but certainly we are the convener or facilitator of that money that comes into the investor in the way of credit, and we provide credit to the projects once the projects are vetted, and then it becomes a project. So the program was really created in 1986 to privatize the production of low-income housing, right? The HUD program wasn't working so well, neither was RD, and government decided we need to just privatize the whole program, and this is really an effort to kind of bring in the private equity to these projects to create low-income housing. So that is the program that's been around, and this has been very successful and has the bipartisan support. And at some point when there was a change in leadership at the Washington, there was conversation about, okay, is the program even going to be around or not? But right now, it's really become so popular on the both front that, really, I think we're going to see more increase in the way of, sources. That's, I think we're pretty optimistic in that. So per capita credit comes in and becomes federal pool, then Wisconsin gets the federal credit. In Wisconsin, that's about a little over $2.75 cents per person, so approximately $15.7 million of credit at the federal level. That is given for 10 years, so the power of the credit is such that it's not just 15 million, but combined it's 150 million. And if you really sell it to the investor at, let's say, 90 cents or so, it becomes a significant amount to give to the state to produce low-income housing credit. And then 7 million of state credit that got created 2 years ago, and that's also producing almost half of the units that we're seeing at the 9% level. So I'll talk about that a little bit more as well. And there is a compliance component of the program that I will also talk about. So, Bill, how much time do I have? Probably 10, 15 minutes? Okay.
12 minutes.
Okay. So there are two types of credits. One is the competitive credit, that is 9% credit, we call it. Again, it's a scarce resource. There's a tremendous competition in that program, and we're seeing 3 to 4 competition for every project. Third project gets the credit at this point, and it's allocated on an annual cycle. And there is also another program that's less competitive or no competition involved, but if you qualify, you get the credit. So it's also known as 4% credit, and with that, we have to finance with the tax-exempt bonds as well. So the difference here is with the 9% credit, the project cost is paid for with the private equity. About 2/3 of the project cost covers, the credit covers, or the investor equity covers the cost of the project. With 4% credit, is half of that, so maybe 1/3 would cover it. So the model that you build to a project becomes substantially different. They're altogether totally different types of projects. And so in 2018, Wisconsin had another program that Wisconsin said, okay, we're going to create another pool of state housing tax credits and create $7 million for each year, and provide funding to augment affordable housing. So WIDA took that program and basically ran with it and said, and I think on WIDA's part, not my idea, but everybody's at WIDA, it was pretty clever in that we decided to combine that 4% credit, non-competitive credit that I was talking about, with this state credit, and basically increase the effect of that credit that would be paid for 30% only, add state credit to those projects equal to the federal credit, no more than that, and that all of a sudden becomes 50 to 60% of the total project cost being paid by state credit. So we're on 2-year cycle, second year of the cycle we completed in 2019, and we have been getting good applications, good projects, and as a result, we're creating almost half of the production. We've increased by 50%, so that's terrific news. And that's going to continue on for the next 6 years, or next 4 cycles, but we're hopeful that it's going to continue on with the effect being seen here. And on the state program, let me also give you just a couple of examples, because you probably want to know a little bit more about that. So in 2019, we received 22 applications under that program. We awarded 11, and everybody who met the threshold were awarded credit. Some projects didn't proceed, a couple of them didn't proceed, they returned credits, but nonetheless, I want to give a sense of kind of the competition involved in that program. 2018, we received 15 applications, we awarded 9, and they were all eligible to proceed. In other words, 6 of them did not meet the threshold. And so it's less competitive, but if you can make your project to work with that program, I would encourage you to highly take a look at that program as well. And that is also, it's designed to be annual allocation competitive in nature, but again, the competition from these 2 results is a little bit less there. So we talked about this, right? Okay. So property receiving housing tax credit requirements. Certainly there is money available, but it's for nothing. So we do ask that there is some restriction placed on the project. The federal requirement is either one of those 2. 20% of the units household below 50% income level or 40% of at 60% income level. So as long as you're meeting one of those two requirements, you would be eligible for credit. There is another element of income averaging. That's the third element that's pointed out there that allows for projects to go a little bit over 60% by compensating for putting more units at the lower income than 60%. But in reality, WIDA, it's a tax credit and it's a scarce resources. One of the things that we're charged with is to create the qualified allocation plan or QAP and really have a good effect. So as a state agency, we have really honed in on this area. Low income aspect of the project is very important. Yeah, we want to, 60% income level is eligible for the project, but we want to see deeper targeting than that. So we give really generous points for folks to put in like 30, 40, or 50%. So in a typical development, Nicole can probably vouch to this. In a typical development, there's less 60% units than more 50 and 40 and 30, right? So because of the incentive that we give out via point system, and that is the reality. So let's talk a little bit about the competition and what does it look like. What's the application? Is it so difficult to get? Certainly, it is difficult to get, and it's at a statewide level. And we receive typically in 9% program 50 to 60 applications, and those developments tend to be anywhere from 50 to 100 unit typically. And again, like I said, in the state program, we've received 22 applications. What's interesting about the 4% credit is that it's the state combined 4% credit I'm talking about is that we have seen a little bit larger projects with a little bit more economy of scale where there is a good revenue stream and good market like Madison and Milwaukee market has been successful with that, even though the initial target for that program was to really target the rural areas. But we're seeing, and we're giving a bunch of points to really allow for applications to come in through rural rural areas, but that's not happened in reality. So those are larger type developments that have good support for income level to kind of support the higher level of debt instead of just tax credits. In terms of the review process, so we have a series of threshold, and we hold the meeting and go through the threshold. So each of those applications are driven or divvied up among 9 or 10 underwriters, including myself, and we each look at 10 applications together. We have weekly meeting twice a week to kind of discuss any quirks in the deal or any anomaly that doesn't meet to our kind of a qualified allocation plan, and then we deliberate, and we basically have to make the hard announcement, and whereby 2/3 of the folks are not happy, 1/3 are very happy. So we have the other area of our qualified allocation plan, which is the plan by which we dole out credits, and that's also on our website, by the way. Credit is divided in Wisconsin among 5 set-asides here. Nonprofit by statute, we have to put in minimum 10%. We've been doing that for a long time now. Just in the last, I don't know, probably 10 years or so, we created this affordable supportive housing set-aside, and that is one set-aside that we're continuing on. Rural set-aside, that's 15% of the allocation now. Is still very much needed set-aside in our mind, and not enough is being done, and there is new initiative at WIDA to certainly continue to focus on that front. Preservation set-aside used to be one of the largest in the nation at 40%. Now we've kind of scaled it back to 20%. So that is really the projects that would come in that have the subsidy attached, and we felt that HUD program and RD program, any existing units that are really catering to the lowest of the low. Anytime they want to get credit to help with rehabbing the project and all that, we're all for that. So that set-aside is really done well, and the competition on that set-aside is a little bit less. Then general set aside, we have 35% allocation there, and that is anything and everything that, new construction, adaptive reuse, anything else that doesn't fit into those buckets. But typically in concept, in general set aside tends to be a little bit more competitive than any of the set aside. So people, if they want to get the credit, they tend to choose the others first. These are the QAP objectives in Wisconsin. Again, increasing the supply of affordable housing and really spreading our dollar to the max is really a two-pronged approach here. If you listen to use of credit. In addition to that, certainly we want to encourage developments in the area where there is economic growth, and also we want to really support, the supportive housing and solve homelessness. There is incentive to do that through our credit program as well. Again, like Nicole said, series of thresholds. So these are like you're in or out kind of a scenario. So you have to have all of these. You have to have the site control in that, there has to be a purchase, or, there has to be a long-term contract for which that allows for us to review the application and secure that contract. And the market study, we want to create projects where there's good market. Financial feasibility is another threshold, not only just in the way of sources and uses, but long-term, how does the project operate, and is this project viable? Because at the end of the day, we put in like 30-year LURA, land use restriction on that project, and we want to see that is continually viable even with the low-income rent structure in place. Then there is acquisition rehab. Those projects that are coming in on the presidential side have a little bit more heightened requirements. So in the way of scoring, this is our scoring elements. You can see how we've kind of divided the 312 points. And last point here, location points, you can see, as I alluded, 35 points, that's only given to really 4% federal and state combined credit. So in essence, we're really looking at 277 points. And you can kind of see, where the high points, right? Number 5 serves lowest income residents, 60 points there. That's to drive home the point that we are really wanting to really do the best we can to show the effect of the credit. In fact, if we showed those point numbers, here, you can see it serves lowest income residents is the highest scoring. The financial leverage is kind of interesting category in that, if you bring in more other financial resources and, lean less on the credit, then you get more points. So the Dane County Housing and City of Madison Housing Funds have been really critical in producing, housing in Dane County that I had kind of illustrated earlier. Again, location points, that's only available to 4% credits. And other elements you can see, I won't go over each one of them, but certainly energy efficiency and sustainability, area of economic opportunity, and neighborhood revitalization. All those are really, really important elements. There is also design element and the project team, who's sponsoring the project. And not only is that important to us, but it's really important to the investor. Mars is probably going to talk more about that. And if you have zoning, certainly you get more points. And with that, I will pass it on to you.
Can we just get a sense of the audience? How many of you work for local or state government? How many of you work for nonprofits on the support service side? How many of you do housing development? How many of you are pretty familiar with the housing credit program? Okay, all right, thanks. So let me just start, let's see. So I just want to start with telling you a little bit about SENER and what we can offer, because we're here to be a resource for you. So we want to touch on some of the different programs that we work on that we can hopefully help you with in the future. So SENER, some of you might know us previously as Great Lakes Capital Fund. We operate largely in the Midwest, in the states of Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. About 5-6 years ago, we did acquire a similar company that does affordable housing syndication in the Mid-Atlantic. So we have an office in Wilmington, Delaware, and are doing some things in the Mid-Atlantic as well. The bulk of our housing credit business is in the Midwest. So in those states that I mentioned, we have a number, our headquarters are in Lansing, Michigan. We've got offices in Detroit and Grand Rapids. We have an office here in Madison. Chris Gillings is in the back of the room, is our originator for our Wisconsin market. And so that's where we're based. We are what's called a Community Development Financial Institution, a CDFI. So although housing credits is how we started, and we've been doing housing tax credit syndication for 25 plus years, that's how we started our business and really started in Michigan and kind of grew from there. We also offer other programs that we work on. So on our investment side, we syndicate low-income housing tax credits, which are used for affordable housing. We do new market tax credits, which are largely used for commercial and non-housing, although it can be used for housing as well. And also historic tax credits. Those are all three. Those are federal tax credit programs that we can syndicate and administer. We also have a number of lending programs. So on the lending side, as a CDFI, we can do pre-development loans. We can do acquisition loans, so help developers acquire property. Pre-development funds to help put your deals together, help cover some of those upfront costs. We do permanent financing, so ongoing 15 to 20, 25-year financing on your developments. We also have a title company, so we can do some title work on those deals. And then we also have a development arm, which does some development, but then also provides technical assistance and can act as a co-developer advisory role to those nonprofits and smaller development companies that might need some capacity building. We can help with those kinds of things as well. And in fact, our development arm is headed up by Chris Laurent, who is also here out of our Madison, Wisconsin office. So with that, I wanted to, so that's just a kind of background on the different programs that we have to offer. And you'll see that when we get to the last slides, we have an example that Nicole put together of the project that she was talking about earlier, and we'll talk about the different roles that Synera actually played in that development. So what is our main role here as the syndicator? So syndicator is kind of the go-between, the entity that syndicates or, quote, sells the tax credits, right? So we're the entity that brings together the developers and the investors. So we're the middleman. And because the credits are actually purchased, so there's a whole market out there. Again, this program's been around since the 1986 Tax Reform Act. It's been around over more than 30 years. There's a whole market out there to buy and sell these tax credits. Just a little bit about how we're set up. So we've got about 100 employees at our company. And we have groups that kind of take the lead and handle different parts of the development throughout the life. So we have a group of originators who work with the developers, go out and look at their properties, are helping to put together the numbers, might assist with the applications for to WIDA in terms of their tax credit and financing. So we'll help provide letters for their applications. So those folks are really working very closely with the developers. Once we secure a deal, we have a whole group that are responsible for underwriting the development. So they're looking at the numbers, the performas. They're putting together a 15-year performa to make sure that these developments are going to be successful and be financially viable for the long term. So that's our underwriting group. They take it through to the closing process. In the closing, and I won't get into the details on this, but essentially at the closing, and we've talked about partnership has been used a lot in the various sessions that we've heard, these are literally set up as partnerships. So at the development level, an apartment complex may be owned by a limited partnership, and the developer acts as the general partner of that partnership, and the investor actually comes in and owns 99% of the development. So the investors are actually owners of these apartment complexes. So they're not, quote, investors maybe in the typical way that you might think of it. They're not also not donating. This is not a charitable donation. These are investments, and they own them, and they own them for the long term. So, we are kind of in charge of the closing process, and then we have a group of folks that are responsible for the long-term asset management of these properties. So while you have a property management company, Gorman has a property management company that is actually managing the day-to-day property, we have a group of folks that are actually watching over them and having them report to us on a monthly basis so that we can then report up to our investors, who are ultimately the owners of the property. So that's kind of how we're set up. Let's see. So really kind of how does this work? So I just want to touch upon what are we doing with these tax credits? How do they actually come into the deal, and how do they actually help a development? The tax credits themselves can't do anything unless they're actually converted into equity. And so that's what we're doing in the process of selling the tax credits. We are taking those credits. We are have an agreement with our investors that they are going to purchase those, and they are going to take those tax credits off of their income tax return, their federal income tax return, and in return, they're going to infuse money into the development. So we're converting credits into equity. It's kind of like, I like to compare it to a mortgage. How many of you have a mortgage? Multiple mortgages, lines of credit. When you go to get a mortgage, the bank's going to want you to put a certain amount of equity down, right? The more money you put down in the form of equity, the lower the mortgages that you have to take out, right? The lower the mortgage, the lower your mortgage payment, right? So the goal of this program is to get the total development cost of these apartment complexes down to a point where there's a small mortgage on the property, and by having a small mortgage, you can then have low rents. So that's really what the goal of this program is. And what we're seeing today, and this fluctuates over time depending on the current market for tax credits and what the pricing is, what we're seeing today is that the equity that's coming into these deals is covering anywhere from 50 to 75% of the total development cost of these apartment complexes. That's substantial. That's a huge resource. And again, this is equity. This doesn't have to be paid back. This is not a loan. So that's why these are so valuable, and that's why you're seeing 4 applications for every 1 application that's getting funded. And then that's, again, this idea of the more equity you can get into the deal, the lower the debt, the lower the rent levels, and that's what makes it affordable to the various groups that we try to serve here in terms of workforce housing, families, seniors, veterans. And so why do they have to sell these? Well, generally speaking, developers don't have the amount of tax liability that you would need to actually utilize all these credits. And even individuals don't usually, but even a sophisticated large development company generally just doesn't have that much federal tax liability to actually use all of these. So that's why they're selling them off to these investors. Well, who are these investors? Who's buying these things? Well, there's two things there's one thing that you have to have in order to use these tax credits, and that is federal tax liability. So nonprofits are not buying tax credits, okay? You can't use tax credits if you're a tax-exempt organization. So you have to have federal income tax liability. The other driver that we see in this industry is the Community Reinvestment Act. How many people know what that is, the CRA? Community Reinvestment Act, which was passed in the 70s, essentially is telling banks, you need to take all those deposits that you get and you need to reinvest those into your communities, into the communities where you're taking those deposits from. So you can't take all the money out of Madison, Wisconsin and make all your loans out on the West Coast. That's just not how it works. And their regulators watch this, and they have exams, and they have generally 3-year cycles. And if they're not doing those things, then they kind of get their hands slapped, and then they're prohibited from doing things like mergers, right? Mergers are big now, bank mergers. Well, if you're not getting a good examination score on CRA, then you're not going to be allowed to buy that bank or to merge with other banks. So CRA is a big driver in this industry, and the reason is because under the tax credit program is actually a specified program under the CRA regulations as meeting the investment test. Banks have lending tests and investment tests. Tax credit program falls under the investment test. It very clearly is stated in the Q&As that this program qualifies. So the bulk of the investors in this industry are banks, and historically that's really been the largest contingency. National banks, regional banks, community banks. So your J.P. Morgans, your Wells Fargos, your Fifth Thirds, Comerica Bank, Huntington Bank, your community banks here. There's a bank up in Conomowoc that has invested in a number of our funds. First Bank Financial Center that would be considered more of a community bank. Insurance companies have really started coming to the market during the housing crisis. Do you know okay in time? Okay. Insurance companies, there's always been a handful of insurance companies who have invested in this program over the years, mainly life insurance companies, because the way that life insurance companies, just because of the business they're in, the cycle and the long-term nature of this investment works well for them. Property and casualty companies, not so much, although we're seeing more of them. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac historically have been one of the largest investors in this industry. In fact, before the housing crisis, they represented about 25% of the entire market, those two entities combined. Then we had the housing crisis, they stopped investing, they are back in the market now again. So we're really happy to have them back. They're actually investing with us. So just to recap some things that we've said, it's a really complicated financing structure. You're going to see this in the slides to follow. It's an extremely valuable source, as you can see, when you're covering 50 to 75% of the cost of a project with money that doesn't have to be paid back. That's pretty nice. It's more than 30 years old, and it has really been probably one of the most, if not the most, successful housing program in the United States. Ironically enough, it is not administered through the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. It is administered through the Internal Revenue Service, which is unusual. But given that, there are so many levels of oversight on this program, which has led to, I think, the reason why it's been so successful. So you've got the Internal Revenue Service that the state housing finance agencies have to report to on an annual basis. You have the housing finance agencies that have to, that are administering the program. They also have a whole team of compliance people that are out looking at these developments, making sure that there are actually low-income people living in these developments, that they've qualified them correctly. And then you've got us, the syndicators, and we've got a whole group of people going out to make sure on behalf of our investors that these developments are going to be successful, again, in the long run, and deliver those tax credits that the investors have agreed to purchase. All of that leads to the fact that if you look at this program over 30 years old, the cumulative foreclosure rate in this program is less than 1%. That's unheard of in any type of real estate. We've never had a foreclosure in our portfolio. because we're very hands-on, and we will step in the shoes and come in and take over in the general partner position if we have to. And as Sridhar said, this program has benefited from both sides of the political table in terms of its support, and we have escaped tax reform, negative results. For the most part, this program's been really successful in not being eliminated, and in fact has seen growth over the years. And the last thing I just want to say is the quality of these developments. I mean, they are, you would never, when you drive by these developments, you don't know that these are affordable housing. I had the pleasure of taking one of our big investors, one of our large insurance companies that is actually based in Milwaukee. You can probably guess who it is. And we had their entire real estate team that Chris and I took them on a tour last week to visit 3 of the housing tax credit developments that we did. All 3 of those had low-income housing credits as well as historic tax credits. Absolutely beautiful, beautiful developments. And the one I want to mention, if you haven't seen it, you should go and look at it, is the Pabst Brewery, which actually Gorman undertook. There's the first development, the first real development in that whole Pabst Blue Ribbon Brewery area, which was essentially vacant for, I don't know, many, many years. And either the land was either vacant or the buildings, the historic buildings on that site were vacant for a number of years. You usually need something to be the stimulus to stimulate other growth. And this tax credit program, one of the reasons why it came to being is not just because the market failure that Bill talked about, which is true, but also to be a stimulus to be the first ones in, because a lot of for-profit developers won't be the first ones in unless there's some type of subsidy. And if you go, I was there 5 years ago. I stayed in the hotel next to the Lofts, which was the first building in. There's nothing else there. And today, I stayed there last week. It is unbelievable. The entire area has been completely redeveloped and is gorgeous. New other hotels, other market rate developments. It's been very successful.
All right, so thank you.
We still have a few more
Yeah, sure.
slides, is that cool?
Oh, sorry.
We've got about 5 minutes.
Sorry, yeah, I'll run through this. So I just kind of wanted to complete the picture, since we just talked about tax credits, on the financing for this example project. So the tax credit equity is the main source up at the top there. Almost 50% of the total development cost, as Marge talked about. In reality, we were eligible for more tax credits than we received, but to be competitive under the WIDA QAP, we had to request less than that. And that's that financial leverage score that Sridhar was talking about, which was 40 points. We get a high score. I think we maxed our score on that one. If we bring in other sources, so that's where all of that and having a project that's really a community priority and having access to county affordable housing funds and TIF is so important, not to just financially support the deal, but to make it competitive under the WIDA process. And then also to tie into what Marge had talked about was our first mortgage here, you'll see, which was Scenair lending and Scenair on the investment side. So they provided all of our financing for loans and equity. Our first mortgage is about $4 million on an almost $15 million project. That is a lot lower than what you would see on a market rate project, which might have, 80% loan to value. So that really is what allows us to charge the affordable rents for the long term, for the 30-year period, as Sridhar talked about. We have 64 units in this development. 55 of them are affordable to 60% AMI and below, including, I think, 13 at 30% AMI. So really, in order to make that possible, all of these funding sources are critical. So the city of Sun Prairie, again, this was in a TIF district. Sanair provided the TIF loan that was backed by that TIF subsidy from the city. We got a CMF loan, which is capital magnet funds, also from Sanair. Again, they are that CDFI that Marge talked about, and that's financing that they have access to. CDBG was a Dane County Community Development Block Grant. And again, that's where the fact that this was a blighted property was critical. That's the reason we could use that financing to acquire the property, because it was considered blighted. And then the Dane County Affordable Housing Funds, those are the funds that County Executive Parisi was talking about this morning. We received that grant. And then the Federal Home Loan Bank is a bank for banks, and they have an annual funding round for affordable housing that we applied to and received. So I'm just going to put the timeline up here, which I can leave up as we answer questions. But again, that really long process that I was talking about, we first, I think, met with the city in 2016. We applied to WIDA at the very end of December 2017. So all of that time was kind of lining up our application. We started, we closed in December 2018 and started construction at the very beginning of this year. And we're set to be completed in the spring. So that's kind of that whole 4-year timeline from inception to completion. All right, now I'm done, Bill.
Time for questions. Yes.
So this is a little bit of a loaded question. I actually come with a background of being a property manager for a tax credit property, but I'm currently a coordinator for the YWCA for permanent supportive housing. So I'm coming from 2 different lenses here. When I worked in affordable housing as a property manager, I found that there was quite a bit of eyes from WIDA as far as like compliance related matters. But I want to know and see I want to be sure that there is some sort of social justice lens as well, and that making sure that these investors, these property management companies are also operating with fair housing in mind, with social justice in mind, and kind of like a people or profit idea. So I just wanted to kind of get an idea of what your thoughts are on making sure that, you know, we're doing our due diligence with this money, that we're empowering our community.
Well, I can take a stab at that, and you guys can add in. So I think one of the most effective ways of advancing goals like that is having communities or even the funding sources put that in their requirements. And that's something that the City of Madison and Dane County have been really incredible at, particularly as of late. The City of Madison is very focused on equity and social issues, and they require, even at your initial applications, that you submit affirmative fair housing plans, that you talk about what communities are you least likely to reach, and then what agencies are you going to work with to reach out to those populations. So yes, there are a lot of people looking at compliance, like you say, and incomes and the numbers and looking at paperwork. But I think some of those issues are really brought to the forefront by the local municipalities in terms of how they're going to look at that. And if I'm not meeting those goals, they will let me know. You know, we have to submit our marketing materials to them prior to starting lease up, and they'll let me know, hey, make sure that you send it to this. Give me an updated report on who you have reached out to, what you got back. They're very proactive in that, which is not like every other community, but I think it's a really great step in moving that forward.
Yeah, I work for a nonprofit, and we've been approached on several occasions over the years to sign off on a developer's plan to apply for the tax credits, things like that. And part of signing off on it has been a commitment from the developer to reach back to us to pull names off of our list for low-income people. The reality of that, as an example, has been either we hear nothing from them ever again, or they make one minimal phone call. So it's a requirement, they get points for it, but the follow-up and the compliance, you know, is I'm questioning that. I guess I'm asking, what are the real teeth here for non-compliance? Because I've seen requirements, seen points be given out, seen credits being given out, and then developers or owners not truly following through the way they said they would. And then the city and others say, oh, I'm sorry, I can't do anything, money's been given out, ownership, title deeds, and so on. So, thoughts?
So in terms of what's being promised and what's not being delivered, we have compliance folks that go out and visit every 1 to 3 years and look at these properties and make sure that, wherever the points are given, that they are delivering on those. For instance, the supportive housing points that we give out, those points, the compliance officers would take a look at it and see what the outreach program is and what, self-monitoring in a way, because there's not a program that governs all the compliance on that front. But at the same time, there has to be some reasonable approach being taken to reach out to community organizations and make sure that, there's good effort or good faith effort being made on that. And ultimately, if the developer doesn't really live up to those expectations, there's an investor that's going to breathe down on their neck as well. But ultimately, IRS, if the deal is non-compliant with WIDA, we have a credit recapture scenario. So I think developer community is very aware of that, and that's very risky proposition. Money that's already been given out, the developer actually has to pay it back to the investor in that scenario, and that's very difficult. The other point, last point I want to make is all the funding sources that Nicole mentioned, they also have strings attached, and they're going to have their own monitoring programs as well, so they're on the lookout for those as well.
One other thought on that too, WIDA, they obviously have this big compliance arm and responsibility as far as monitoring the tax credit, and the hammer for them is getting the project or the investment in trouble with the IRS to take back the credits, right? So that's kind of one category, but I think the issue you're talking about, which Sridhar mentioned, the supportive housing, and there's not a good enough connection. I think you explaining that issue to WIDA, and that falls in a different category, which could impact developer team score as they go forward. So it's not necessarily an IRS violation,
Right.
but it's kind of WIDA policy that they have apparently not lived up to. So probably just being contacting WIDA and letting them know, and that could impact scoring going forward.
Right.
Yes?
I was wondering, what type or what percent of return are the investors seeing on these projects?
So the returns on tax credits, well, we generally compare them to the 10-year Treasury, although they're significantly higher than the Treasury. But they tend to be, because it's a longer-term investment, that's what 10 and 20-year Treasury is what we're usually comparing it to. So right in the market today, and this will fluctuate over the years depending on demand for the credits. Right now, across the country, the returns are, and this is after-tax returns, after-tax are anywhere from 3 to 6% return, which sounds really low, but still look at where the Treasury's at right now, 1 to 2%. It's considered a very safe investment. So that's the other thing. This is considered a very safe investment, and that's why you're not seeing really high returns on these. And what's really driving these returns down is the Community Reinvestment Act is really driving this program. And if investors really need those to make those investments in order to get their exam score where they need it, they're willing to take a fairly low return. We saw higher returns when the housing crisis hit and Fannie Freddie pulled out. Returns went up to the 10 to 12% range, but that's pretty abnormal in this market.
And if I could just add something on to that, just contrast it to like the market rate development that I think Nicole made a reference to. If a developer wants to build a building without low mounting tax credits, right? You've got really two sources of income on your deal: cash equity and bank debt. So, okay, let's say the bank debt's 80%, 20% equity. So on Nicole's model of $14 million, how it came to the math, it's $3 million of equity. Those investors, whoever they are, not margin crowd, but just conventional, they want big returns. They want 15, 18%. So so for the developer to deliver, pay all the expenses, returns to the investors, we have to charge high rents, right? So that's kind of the market rate model, is the pressure in this capitalism driving, you charge us as much as you can, bring the return to the owners. And so tax credits is really just flipping that, is trying to create huge amounts of equity using the tax credit program to squeeze that down, keep rents low. So just contrasting those.
And just so you're aware, and we won't get into the details of this, but how a return is calculated in a regular market rate development versus a tax credit development are totally different. A market, and this is like an education that I always have to go to when I talk to new investors. In a regular market rate deal, your return is based on the cash flow, how much cash is the apartment complex producing, and the tail end, how much you're going to sell it for at the back end. We don't consider any of that in a tax credit development. The return to the investors for tax credit investment is based strictly on the tax benefits they were receiving, which are the tax losses that the project is generating and the actual tax credits themselves. So this is a tax advantaged investment, not a real estate investment in terms of calculation.
We got one more question.
So a general question, I know that you mentioned that developers meet the minimum requirement in terms of, and maybe you didn't say minimum, but affirmative actions. I mean, and so meeting the minimum requirement, and how often do investors try to exceed what that minimum requirement would be? Is that standardized, or where does that fit in what you talked about?
It's going to be driven by the QAP.
Sorry, I'm not sure. Are you talking about affirmative, like marketing practices or a minimum?
Now, you mentioned affirmative action plans in terms of the city have the basic affirmative action plans that you're all required to meet.
So there,
And so how often do you go to meet that minimum requirement, and how often do you go to exceed that? And what does that look like?
I guess, so the plan that we usually submit is a HUD format, right? But we fill in the criteria depending on the site. Okay, this is the census tract. This is the breakout in that census tract, this percentage of Caucasians, this percentage of African Americans. And then it breaks down into, given that breakout and who you are marketing to, who are you least likely to reach in your marketing? And it's usually in this area, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and Madison-Dane County. And then you have to identify agencies and groups that you will reach out to reach those agencies. That's kind of I would say that the city of Madison has you go above and beyond in terms of even submitting that in the beginning. A lot of communities don't ask for that. It's not something that's on their radar. But in that form itself, I guess I'm not thinking of there's not another section of the form where you say, okay, and now we're going to do even more, because it's kind of like you're identifying just from the beginning who is the hardest to reach. You're kind of going there right away, and then how am I going to reach them? If that makes sense.
How you will market the property.
Yeah, how you will market the property to them.
Okay, well, we're way out of time, so please give me a hand.